The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read. Your source for news, politics, sports, and all things trending. Here's your host, Marcus Gentry.
Welcome back, people. This is the Daily Read, and I am your host, Marcus Gentry. This is part 2 to my 2-hour series on the destruction of black civilization. And is our history of civilization linear or is it cyclic? I think it's cyclic. I think there were civilizations of black people also, not just white people. You know, I know it's going to be some people out there saying that, they're just trying to make white people seem like they are older than blacks. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is our history, our civilizations are cyclic. Not only did we have blacks in this cycle who were kings and queens over Africa, but there were cycles before that predates what we know. This is some deep stuff. And like I say, do your own research. Don't just go off of what I'm saying. Do your own research. Let's continue on. Now, this is very important, people, because I've been in cycles. I've been in ciphers and circles of black men and women who are discovering that we were the originators. We were the cradle of life. We were kings and queens. You hear it all the time. But what I'm trying to bring to you is, like I say, this is going to be controversial. That there were cycles. And what we are talking about when we say we were kings and queens, we are talking about our civilization, our cycle of earth before the invaders came. Remember, Greg Braden is saying they found proof, like in Antarctic, under the sheets of ice, that there was civilization down there at least 20,000 years ago. That predates most of the stuff that we know. This is deep. You can't avoid this stuff. You know, if somebody came to me and told me they found, if I go to a black scholar and he tells me that 5,000-6,000 years ago we were the kings and queens, and then, we were taken over by invaders, and we were the original man, this and that, and then they bring out proof through carbon dating and structures and things like that, that there were actually cycles. There were actually other civilizations, not just ours. We had a powerful civilization, but those people got wiped out, and then they migrated and came and took our shit. Let's continue on.
Quite early that the people in the interior can spot the arrogant and superior African just as easily as they recognize the arrogant and superior white investigator. They will give answers to questions readily enough, but not the right answers. I therefore selected only those whose heartbeats seemed to be tuned to the heartbeats of the great common people from whom all of us came. The simple fact was that while they were quite familiar with European research people roaming freely all over the country, a black doing field studies in the Sudan is a phenomenon indeed. Ethiopia, the new name for Abyssinia, like the Republic of the Sudan, is also ruled by people of mixed blood who not only do not consider themselves African by race, but who maintain a privileged class society based upon color. In ancient times, African and Ethiopian were used interchangeably because both meant the same thing, a black. This, of course, was before the Caucasians began to reorder the earth to suit themselves and found it necessary to stake their birthright over the land of the blacks also.
I'm going to stop that right there. Like I said, this is going to be deep and controversial, and I run up against the clock on iHeartRadio for 1 hour sessions. So I'm going to end this first part to this series, and then I'm going to continue on with the next part.
And submissive non-white world, while all this white power was being amassed, is no longer either sleeping or submissive. 3. Even the African revolt against colonialism and the worldwide challenge to white domination of the entire earth, even these signals of change do not disturb these scholars of imperialism. They represent the lords of the earth, controlling all levels of education, science, and research. They control the education of blacks throughout the world. Therefore, they see no need, even in the 1970s, to take a new look at the history of the blacks from its beginning and start the work of restoring the pages they deleted or ignored. For example, where even unmixed black pharaohs became white, and the originally black population was never referred to as Egyptians at all. The black kings who founded and ruled from the first dynasty are disguised as such, while the Scythian kings, white, of the small areas of Lower Egypt are presented as the pharaohs of all Egypt, even when African pharaohs were on the throne of Upper Egypt. Blotting the blacks out of history included replacing African names of persons, places, and things with Arabic and European names. One wave of the master's magic wand, and black Hamites and even Cushites, like their early Egyptian brothers, are no longer Africans. Their periodization of African history is carefully arranged in such a way that the history becomes the history of Arabs and Europeans in Africa, and not the history of Africans in it.
I'm going to stop that right there. Like I was saying in the beginning, they lost their civilization. They lost it through calamity and catastrophe. And what this scholar is finding out is he's asking the question, why did they replace us? They replaced us because they lost their bountiful civilizations, and they found a new civilization that was just as mighty as theirs, but we had different technologies. We had different ways. Martin Luther King said it best in his speech. We lost our religion, our culture, our gods. Many of us have even lost our minds. We lost it to the conquerors. Let's keep going.
African History, a recent publication of the American Historical Association as a guide to teaching, their purpose becomes clear in the arrangement itself. First period is from the fall of the Roman Empire to 700 AD, Arab invasions. The second period of African history is the period of Islamic civilization, 700 AD, to the coming of the Europeans in 1500. The European period from 1500 to 1960 is subdivided at 1880 to mark the period of colonialism. There is no period of black civilization in black Africa. Such is the Caucasian viewpoint, almost a religion. Their very first period eliminates 4,000 years of black civilization and the very greatest periods of African achievements. Their second period is devoted to the Arabs and Berbers in Africa. And in their third period, the focus is on European civilization. And it is all done under the heading of African history. Where it was impossible to deny black achievements, equal and often above the whites, such achievements were attributed to some kind of Caucasian influence, even if imaginary. More intolerable as the young find themselves between two fires: the white racists who determine the very nature of their education, and the Negro educators who also see the world through the blue eyes of the Saxons. In short, they are forced to turn to their own devices because they find so many of their own race who should be working with them in the camps of the enemy.
Notice what he said. He said they tried to erase 4,000 years of African empire, African history. But like Braden said, this stuff is cyclic. What Chancellor Williams was finding out was the 4,000 years of history that we know. He was not a geologist. He was not the type of man to go out and dig up the earth and find older civilizations of blacks that were older than what we know. This is some deep stuff.
Insofar as periodization is concerned, no one should be so naive as to expect a proper division of African history while the field is almost completely preempted by the enemies of that history. The new research efforts call for black experts not only in the field of history but also in the allied fields from which African history must heavily draw: archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, etc. The new approach. The first period would begin with prehistory, primarily because Norway, one of the oldest cities on earth, was begun by the blacks before recorded history. Another important reason is that the Canaanites and other white agents had invaded the Nile Delta and established a stronghold in Lower Egypt, then northeastern Ethiopia or Kem, in prehistoric times. This early concentration of whites along the sea coast of the land of the blacks is a circumstance of crucial importance in black history because it was exactly from this development that the achievements of the blacks were overshadowed by later writers or blotted out entirely.
Now, this is getting to the good stuff. What he's basically trying to explain, people, is that the Canaanites, the Berbers, the invaders, who were mostly white-skinned people, like I said, they lost their civilization. And losing their civilization, they had to go find other civilizations. And they brought their own ways and technologies with them. So as they conquered Lower Egypt and started putting in people who looked like them as pharaohs, it overshadowed our achievements. It overshadowed who we were. This is some deep stuff. I love it.
The third period of black history in Egypt should begin with the 7th dynasty, 2181 BC, and be subdivided into the tragic periods of internal turmoil and white invasions. The first subdivision would be from 2181 BC to 2040 BC. The 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th dynasties thereafter. Strict chronology should be ignored in order to focus on a single issue: the role of invasions and conquest in the destruction of black civilization, with the resulting ethnic transformation of Egypt from black to brown, Afro-Asian and Afro-European to white. This means that the second subdivision would bypass the restoration period of the great 11th and 12th dynasties. For the next period of invasion and conquest, the Hebrew Hyksos rule, 1645 to 1567 BC, again bypassing the new empire, the other subdivisions would study the periods of the Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, and Arab invasions and the impact of their conquest and rule on the blacks. The fourth major division would begin with the skipped over 11th and 12th dynasties, 1786 to 1233 BC, the great 18th, 1567 to 1320, and then continue from the age of Ramses to the end of the 24th dynasty, 1330 to 730.
Now, Ramses is, for a lot of people, really the start of white Egyptians, because he looked more light-skinned. That was really like the start. And whenever you see the movies, when you see white actors playing Ramses or any kind of pharaoh, that's the start of all of this.
Hyksos rule, 1645 to 1567 BC, again bypassing the new empire, the other subdivisions would study the periods of the Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, and Arab invasions and the impact of their conquest and rule on the blacks. The fourth major division would begin with the skipped over 11th and 12th dynasties, 1786 to 1233 BC, the great 18th, 1567 to 1320, and then continue from the age of Ramses to the end of the 24th dynasty, 1330 to 730. The fifth period should be from the last of the black pharaohs to the destruction of the remaining southern division of the Ethiopian Empire below the First Cataract, 730 BC to the 5th century AD. The sixth period, from the re-emergence of successor black states in the 5th century AD to their final destruction by the Arabs in the 13th century. The seventh period, like the second, should not be a time division of neat and largely irrelevant chronological sequences. It is a study of migrations of the blacks that covered many centuries, but which became more widespread and desperate after the Arab conquest of the original center of black civilization in the Sudan. The long periods of wandering all over the continent, often aimlessly, was the great historic race of the blacks for survival, a race that tried to outdistance famine, disease, slavery, and death. The period that should have an intense, closer-up study and critical analysis extends from the 13th century to colonialism in the 19th. Elsewhere, I have posed the most perplexing question. If the blacks were among the very first builders of civilization, and their land the birthplace of civilization, what has happened to them since that left them at the bottom of world society? Precisely what happened? The Caucasian answer is simple and well known. The blacks were always at the bottom. This answer is clear even in the histories and other educational material they so busily prepare for the blacks themselves.
We're going to take a commercial break, and when we get back, we're going to talk about the more controversial part of this. Because like I said, Chancellor Williams went to Africa and studied this stuff under the lens of trying to find what happened to black civilization. But as Greg Braden is saying, civilizations ebb and flow through this planet. Civilization rise for 4,000-5,000 years, and then a cataclysm happened, or a great destruction happened and destroys it. That's why they are popping up and finding architectural buildings, mummies, and things all over this planet that far predates what we know as people. This is some deep stuff. We'll be back.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
Going to talk about in this program, it's no secret in the scientific community. It is simply there's a resistance to embracing it in the mainstream. So mainstream textbooks, mainstream classrooms, and the reason is because of the pushback from the religious community, from the political community, certainly from the technological community in Egypt. And interestingly, the largest of those is called the Great Pyramid, and it's not the one that people show in the pictures, because the Great Pyramid does not have a capstone. It's flat on top. That capstone was lost at some point in history. There's another one of the three that does have a capstone, and that's the one that the news anchors and television and movies, they always call that the Great Pyramid, and it's not. You see that pyramid, what we're seeing actually is a part of the structure that was never meant to be seen. So there were essentially three layers of the pyramids of Giza and the Great Pyramid. The outer layer was encased in highly polished limestone, looked like marble, white, that would have reflected that light in just a magnificent way. And there are only a few layers of that left on one side at the bottom, because it has been stripped away for convenience, used in other buildings throughout Cairo, in other mosques, and other primarily in other mosques and other structures that are there. Right. So when I was there in 1989, another scientific group was there, and they were given access. This is the only time this has ever happened. They were given access to the casing stones that we see today and permission to drill core samples into those casing stones, because when you do that, you're destroying the stone. So I've been part of it. So obviously it's not happening a lot. So they took the core samples, and I was a geologist. What you would expect to see if these were naturally occurring limestone blocks taken from the surrounding limestone in the area, there's a lot of limestone in the area, you would expect in those core samples to see what you see in naturally occurring limestone. You would expect laminations, you would expect microfossils, maybe visible fossils, because it was presumably from ocean bottom. And what they found in the core samples was just the opposite of that. There were no laminations. The entire block appears to be homogeneous. That's not what you see in nature when nature is laying those year layers after year after year, the layers that go down. But they also found air bubbles, they found insects, and they found human hair. And when they did the chemical analysis, there were chemicals in the blocks that do not occur naturally. So the bottom line, I mean, this is a mind blower. This was 1989 when they found this. It is the question, how did they get massive blocks of such high tolerance fitting perfectly 400 feet above the surface? And, I mean, if you watch the old movies and Charlton Heston, and Exodus, what you see is, a million slaves with ropes and log rollers, and they're rolling them up sand ramps and all that, and maybe that happened in some places later on. That very possibly could have happened later on, but that's not what happened with the three pyramids, the Great Pyramids on Giza. And what they found was what was published, and the pushback was tremendous, is that these stones are what are called, they're artificial stone. And the way they were created is they were, in fact, the stone itself was mined from nearby limestone quarries. It was then pulverized and mixed with a high-tech epoxy that allowed it to be plastic, kind of molten, or at least, soft, poured into molds. And then those molds, it was hardened, and the molds were poured on site. So that's why you could pour one block next to another and get 1/1000th of an inch tolerance.
What Greg Braden is saying is basically, I've been in construction and hauling concrete for 6 or 7 years, and basically what he's saying is that there were frames built, and the stone was basically mined from a quarry, crushed up. And if anybody know about mixing cement for houses, foundations, and things of that nature, they always put down borders, and then they pour the cement inside those borders. So I always, let me turn off this AC so you guys can hear me a little better. But I always suspected that those 10, 15, 20 ton blocks that make up the pyramid, I always suspected that it wasn't something that was hauled in place. You have all kinds of theories of spaceships coming down, lifting these huge blocks and putting them in place, and there's all this big mystery around the pyramids. But it's when I got into concrete, it's basically straightforward. They put up frames, ground up basically a cement and limestone paste, and poured it inside the frames. This is basic masonry, period. This is basic masonry. This is what we do all the time to build the structures that we live in today. There was also another thing he said about how there was an outer layer of textile, some kind of glossy white ceramic that encased the entire pyramid and gave it a shiny, bright look. And over time, the locals have destroyed it to build other buildings with. You see, this is what I think. Like I said, this is my opinion. You can make your own judgments about this. What I think happened is the pyramids and the Sphinx are thousands of years older than what we know. There are other pyramids around the area that were built for pharaohs. But the 3 pyramids that everybody come to know and love, I think they are far older, from a different cycle. That's the reason why there was never any tombs. There's chambers inside of those pyramids, but there were never any bodies. There were never any sarcophaguses inside of those pyramids, because like I said, those pyramids came from a different era, a different cycle. And the people who basically, us, who took over that area, mimicked the pyramids to build tombs for the pharaohs. This is what I believe happened.
That would have actually hardened those bunkers against the shock and awe that we were doing. So the point is, the technology that was used to build the pyramids was so advanced, we weren't even really doing it until the 20th century. And it had military applications that were recognized pretty quickly.
And we still don't do it, and we still aren't using it heavily in our construction or anything like that right now.
No, not in. There are some artists that are using this, but you don't see it in construction. So So this was a mind blower to the scientific community in 1989, because all the textbooks say those blocks were carved and then somehow mysteriously moved into place. On the back of the Sphinx, on the rump, and this is a view that you don't often get in mainstream. They're always looking either a profile or right on at the face. But what you see is there. First of all, the Sphinx is carved from in place from a limestone bluff that was in place. So it's like there was a solid limestone bluff, and the Sphinx was carved, and then all the empty space around it is where the rock was cleared and moved away to so that the Sphinx looks like this isolated standing structure. So it was actually carved in place. When you go around to the back of the Sphinx on the rump, you see erosion marks that are about 12 feet deep in some places. And it's limestone. Limstone's a sedimentary rock. And when there are some parts of the limestone that are more resistant than others, and the softer parts are what get eroded away, creating these erosion marks. Well, there is a geologist from Boston University, Robert Schoch, and I know many people are familiar with his work now, because of the Charlton Heston special. Charlton Heston did a special on the Great Sphinx, and Robert Schoch was the first one that credibly questioned the age of the Sphinx from a geologic perspective. And what he did was he looked at those erosion marks, the same ones I'm looking at, and he said, well, this is obviously fluvial erosion. The term fluvial means high, it's based in water, and it would take high amounts of water moving quickly over long periods of time to create that kind of erosion. Up until that time, the scientists had called it aeolian erosion, which means it was wind blowing, sand like sandpaper and cutting it away. Robert Schoch said, no, it's obvious. This is fluvial erosion. And here's where the kicker comes in. The only time that there has been that kind of water, high amounts, fast moving water over long periods of time, predates anything our textbooks are talking about when it comes to the pyramids. We're told the pyramids were built approximately 4,500, maybe 5,000 years ago. And the water that would be required for that erosion has not been seen since the melting of the ice at the end of the last ice age, which is right around around 12, 13,000 years BP before present. The real scientists, not the pop scientists, they looked at that data and they said, of course, this is fluvial erosion. Of course, it had to have happened, 12, 13,000 years before present. They accepted it, no problem. The geologists have no problem. The historians have a horrible problem, because it means the history is wrong. And the evidence no longer supports the history.
Now I'm gonna stop that right there. This is some deep stuff, people, because we get our history from religious texts sometimes too. So not only is the historians upset about a lot of these new discoveries, some of this stuff is being shoveled under the rug. Remember what I said in the beginning of the show. This guy right here is a geologist. He just doesn't look at old text. He goes out and digs up this stuff and dates it. And there were civilizations here that probably built those pyramids, the original three, and the Sphinx. But what has happened is, as new people moved into that area, they started destroying the pyramids, taking off tile and using it for other purpose. Like he was saying, mosques and buildings and things of that nature. Because you got to know that that's a desert area. So there's not a lot of trees to cut down to build homes. So they had to use what they had in the area. And to these people, those pyramids aren't sacred. They protect it because it's a part of their history in that area. Let's continue on.
So the linear model is what we're teaching our kids. We began ancient Sumeria, Mesopotamia, 5,000, 5,500 years ago. And, then you've got, Rome and Greece and all of that. Well, all of that happens to have occurred within the most recent cycle that began about 5,000 years ago. And what the mathematics, what the archaeology is showing is that our history appears to be closely correlated to 5,125 year long cycles. And there are 5,125 year cycles that make up one big cycle called a precession of the equinox. And I know some of our astronomers and astrologers are familiar with that. It's about 26,000 years. It is related to the way that Earth relates to the sun and to the way that I don't want to go too deep with all of this, but our relationship to our solar system and the Milky Way. And if those of you that remember the 2012 phenomenon, that's what this was all about. 2012 was the end of the fifth 5,125 year long cycle, and the beginning of a new age, a new cycle that we're in right now. So when you plot that out, I didn't know we were going to talk about this. I would have brought some slides. When you plot that out on a graph, when you look at these 5,000 year cycles, so here we are today, 2012, the beginning of a new cycle, or the end of one that began 5,000 years ago. Well, here's what's happening. Archaeological discoveries now are being made that precede that 5,000 year cycle. So when it first started happening,
they used to find stuff that's older than what we know about, but they would shovel it away and say it's an anomaly. It's not real proof. But what has happened is so much of this stuff has been unearthed. So many other civilizations have been unearthed. So many other pieces of pottery have been unearthed that now they can't ignore this stuff. Now they're starting to see that, hey, we might have had the end of a cycle with the flood, and it ushered in a new cycle, which is what we as the people of the world today know about. This is deep.
Scientists said, oh, well, these are anomalies. So, we've got our history and we're sure it's right. And then here's an anomaly and we'll put it over here. We'll come back and look at it later. Well, now there are so many anomalies. The anomalies are telling the new story. So you've got places like the Gulf of Combat in India. It's a 3-mile long, 5-mile wide submerged city. It's under 120 feet of water, 9,500 years before present. Very sophisticated archaeology. We've got Göbekli Tepe in Turkey that is still being excavated and is now over 13,000 years before present. Now that the ice is melting in Antarctica, the satellites are showing massive, complex structures. These aren't like little log cabins or, pit houses. I mean, these are massive structures. The ice has been there for 20,000 years. So the question is, who was building complex architectural structures 20,000 years ago in Antarctica? Well, when you plot those, what you're finding is Rome and Greece and Corral, Peru. That is the most recent 5,000 year cycle. So what we've been studying and what we've been teaching ourselves and our children is not the history of the world forever. It's the history of the world in the most recent cycle. Now we've got to start looking the 5,000 year cycle before that, where we see Corral in Peru, which is now dated. It's the oldest technologically advanced civilization in all of the Americas. It's older than the Inca, than the Aztec, than the Olmec, than the Toltec. It's older than anything. We've got to rewrite all the history books. And next to it, another site has been found that's even older. We're told civilization began 5,000 years ago. That's when these ended. These civilizations ended when we're told that civilization began. So that's a 5,000 year cycle. Now you go back and you look at Göbekli Tepe. So we've got today back to about 5,000 years. 5,000 years to 10,000 years is another 5,000 year cycle. And that's, all the things, Çatalhöyük in Turkey and Koral and all those. Now we're looking at Göbekli Tepe, 13,000. So now we're looking at another 5,000 year cycle. And now we're looking at Antarctica, another 5,000 year cycle. So the evidence strongly supports cyclic civilization. And the question is, what happens every 5,000 years? Why do those civilizations, why do we lose the memory, lose the knowledge of those civilizations? And what happened before those 5 or 6 simultaneous civilizations? Where did they come from? Where did the knowledge for those come from? And all of it leads to the understanding that there have been great catastrophes in our past. And one of those now is hotly contested, but the evidence is very strong for a comet impact during what is called the Pleistocene geologic era, as we were coming out of the last ice age, and that comet plunged us back into an ice age, and that brought an end to a great advanced civilization that existed on Earth. The remnants from that became those 5 simultaneous civilizations. The remnants became, the pyramids in Egypt and China and Indus Valley and all of that. And this is why they had such similar mathematics, architecture, cosmology, and things like that. So
let me put that in layman terms. Every 5,000 years we have great civilizations. But what he's saying is there's evidence of great meteors that have hit the earth in the past. One is what suspected killed the dinosaurs. And then we had another one that brought on the flood. When the flood happened, we went back into another ice age. Now, just imagine this. Say you living back in those days, and you see these meteorites falling from the sky, destroying everything. In your eyes, you're thinking that's the wrath of God, destroying the earth. And then comes this massive levels of ocean rising because the ice caps are melting. So now your cities are flooding. People are dying around you. It looks like Armageddon. This is what was written about in the Bible. And like I say, I see patterns. And what I'm looking at here is a 5,000 year cycle ending and all the technology that was with it. And it ushered in a new era. A new era that made religious text, pyramids, all kinds of stuff that was talking about the time before the flood. Think about that. In the biblical text, there was a time before the flood, and there were people here before the flood. This is some good stuff.
Publicly a lot. Antarctica. I've seen these satellite images of these massive structures that could arguably, they say, pyramids, that are bigger than the Great, much bigger than the Great. Tell me what you've learned.
No, I've seen them as well. So Antarctica is a mystery for a number of reasons. Number one, it is supposed to be international property that no one owns. And there were agreements signed in the early 20th century that it would not be militarized. We signed those same agreements for space, and we signed them for the moon, and both of those have been violated. We have militarized space. We have weapons in space, and there's a lot of controversy about what has been done on the lunar surface and how it's been done. The same goes with Antarctica. We know that China has their military base, Germany has theirs, Russia has theirs, the United States has theirs. We've obviously militarized Antarctica. What has happened since global warming, and as a geologist, I'll just say straight up, global warming is a fact. We've been talking about, we were giving people a heads up that we should be moving into a warming cycle. Humans didn't cause it. We've contributed to it, but if there are no humans, we would still be, the geologic record shows, we would still be in a warming cycle. So the warming is happening, and it is melting this 2 miles of ice that has been there for about 20,000 years. And as that began to happen, it began to expose these complex structures. Now, one of the first things I learned as a student of archaeology is that nature never builds in 90-degree angles.
Right.
And, you won't see a river like coming down and then, doing one of these things, and you don't see wind eroding in a 90-degree angle. So one of the first things you look for, if you're looking on another planet, or if you're looking, for lost civilizations here on Earth, is you begin looking for these evidence of 90-degree angles in architecture.
They basically have been doing this for a long time, people. They have been studying pictures and geographic maps from satellite view, and they can tell when there's a structure underneath the earth or ice. Like he said, 90-degree angles is specific. That's intentional. That's not something that's made by natural wind or water. And this is what they're finding under the ice cap that has been there for 20,000 years. This is why the religious community and the governments and the historians are going crazy.
And what began showing up in Antarctica, and again, this isn't like a little one-room pit house. These are massive, complex structures with room after room after room after room, within rooms, within rooms. And once this was around 2016, 2017, then Google Earth pixelated all of that out. And if you go to look at Antarctica right now, you will not see any of that. However, I've got pre-pixelated images showing where you can compare the same areas. So they don't want us seeing what it is that is there.
Why? Why is
my sense? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, it messes up the story. Remember, there's a battle. There's a battle for what's called the standard model of history. The standard model says we began primitive about 5,000 years ago, and slowly, gradually, we've evolved into the pinnacle of sophistication that we have today, and it's only happened once. What the cyclic model shows is that there are different kinds of technologies, Alex, and you can have an advanced technology and not have it based in transistors and resistors. There are other kinds of technologies.
So there's no telling what kind of technology they're going to find, or they already have found. You can believe if they have found a civilization under the ice cap in Antarctica, they've already been down there. 2 miles of ice is a lot, but with time and technology, they can get down there and find out what's going on with these buildings. And like I say, they're trying to shovel some of this information under the rug because it messes up the status quo. Nobody likes the status quo to be messed up. I hope you guys got some good stuff out of this, and hopefully you can do your own research. His name is Greg Braden and Chancellor Williams. Chancellor Williams, these two men have been were born years apart, but they touched bases on some of the same things. So do your own research, people. Don't just take my word for it. I've done my own research and I'm still researching it. This is the Daily Read, and I'm out.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
Bringing the business.